The bolt of calico fell from Mary Maddox's hands the moment the clerk said it. She had counted every coin twice, her fingers trembling over the wooden counter of Holt's General Store, the midday sun slanting through the dusty window and cutting a line of gold across the worn floorboards. She had needed 3 yards, just 3 yards of the blue calico with the small white flowers. It was the last fabric she needed to finish the curtains for the 2 windows in her cabin, the curtains that would make that cold, hollow place feel like something close to a home. She had been saving for 6 weeks, taking in mending and washing from the boarding house women, denying herself the small things, the licorice at the end of the counter, the tin of peaches she had wanted so badly on a Sunday afternoon when the loneliness got too loud. And she had come up short by 32 cents. She stared at the coins on the counter. She stared at them until they blurred. Then she carefully began to gather them back, sliding each one into the small cloth purse she kept in her apron pocket, keeping her chin level and her jaw tight, because she would not cry in front of Eli Holt. She would not give this town's gossips one single thing to talk about. That was when Eli Holt cleared his throat. "Now, Miss Maddox," he said, his voice carrying that careful, uncomfortable quality of a man delivering news he has not fully decided how to frame. "It has already been taken care of." She stopped. "Beg your pardon, the fabric, all 3 yards." He set his hands flat on the counter and looked somewhere slightly to the left of her face. "A rancher came in this morning and settled an account for you. Said you were to have whatever you needed from the store today on his word." The world tilted. Not because someone had helped her charity was its own humiliation, and she had known enough of it since her husband Thomas had died 14 months ago and left her nothing but 40 acres of scrub land and a mortgage she could not name the full figure of without feeling sick. Not even because the gesture was generous, though it was. It was because of the name. "Which rancher?" she asked, and her voice came out more careful than she intended, scraped clean of anything that might betray her. Eli Holt looked at her for a moment, something flickering behind his eyes that was not quite pity and not quite curiosity, but some uncomfortable hybrid of both. "Samuel Lockhart," he said. And there it was, the name she had spent 4 months trying to unhear. Mary had first seen Samuel Lockhart on an October evening in 1882, when the Kansas wind was carrying the first real bite of winter, and the town of Hadley Creek was settling into itself, the way small towns did at the end of a hard season. Quietly, cautiously, grateful to still be standing. She had been driving her small wagon back from the Pearson farm, where she had delivered a set of mended curtains and received $2 and a jar of honey in return, and one of her wagon wheels had found a rut in the road so deep it had cracked the left spoke clean through. She had sat there on the side of the road for a long moment, looking at the ruined wheel, calculating the distance to town and the distance back to her cabin, and deciding that neither was walkable in the dark with a heavy crate of mending supplies in the back of the wagon. She had been on the verge of doing something uncharacteristic and simply crying about it when she heard hoofbeats. The man who pulled his horse to a stop beside her road was not a man she recognized, which in Hadley Creek was itself unusual, because she had lived there for 2 years by then, and she knew the face of nearly everyone within a 10-mile radius. He was tall in the saddle in a way that suggested he was genuinely tall, not simply advantaged by a good horse. He wore a dark coat that had seen serious weather, and a hat pulled low enough that she could not see his eyes until he tipped it back and looked down at her. "Wheel," he said. "Wheel," she confirmed. He was off his horse in 2 easy movements, and he walked to the wagon and crouched beside the broken spoke with the focused quiet of a man who assessed problems before he spoke about them. Then he stood up and looked at her crate. "Is there anything in that crate that cannot get dirty?" "Most of it," she said. A small, involuntary thing happened at the corner of his mouth. It was barely a smile. It was more like the suggestion of one. "Then I will carry the crate and come back for the wagon in the morning," he said. "Where are you headed?" she had told him, and he had lifted the crate onto his horse without apparent effort, and he had walked beside her for the 1.5 miles to her cabin while his horse followed patiently behind them. He had not talked very much. He had asked her one question about how long she had been in Hadley Creek, and she had told him 2 years, and he had nodded as though this confirmed something. He had asked her if she had help on her land. "Not at the moment," she said, which was the polite version of no. He had set the crate on her porch and tipped his hat and told her his name, Samuel Lockhart, and that he owned the Lockhart Ranch 7 miles north of town, and that he would send a man with a spare wheel spoke in the morning. She had opened her mouth to tell him that was not necessary, that she could handle it herself, that she did not want to owe anyone anything. And she had closed it again because she was cold and tired, and the truth was that she did need the spoke and she did not have the means to get it herself before morning. "Thank you," she said instead. He nodded once and left. The wheel spoke arrived the next morning, delivered by a silent young ranch hand named Pete, who fixed it in under an hour and refused the cup of coffee she offered him. She had thought that would be the end of it. She had been wrong. She had not known then the shape of what Samuel Lockhart was. She had not known that he was the kind of man who noticed things, not loudly, not with performance, but with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who had been taught early that the world did not announce its needs. She had not known that over the next 4 months, he would become the most confusing and unsettling presence in her careful, ordered life. She had not known that he had a dark past that half the county whispered about and the other half was too afraid to. Back in the store, she stood very still while Eli Holt watched her with that careful, uncomfortable expression, and she thought about 3 things simultaneously. She thought about the 32 cents she still did not have. She thought about the fabric with the small white flowers that she had wanted so badly. And she thought about Samuel Lockhart's face on the night he had walked her home in the dark, the way he had watched the road ahead of them rather than watching her, as though he was giving her the privacy of not being observed. "I cannot accept it," she said. Eli Holt blinked. "The fabric." "Yes, Miss Maddox," he said carefully. "He has already paid." "Then he will have to unpay it," she said, and she picked up her small purse and walked out of the store. She stood on the boardwalk outside for a moment in the thin November light of 1882, her hands clasped in front of her and her heart doing something complicated and irregular in her chest. The street of Hadley Creek moved past her, a woman in a blue dress crossing toward the milliner's, a man loading grain sacks onto a flatbed, 2 boys chasing a dog down the side alley, all of it normal, all of it ordinary, all of it proceeding without reference to the fact that something had just cracked open inside her chest in a way she did not entirely understand. She did not want to owe Samuel Lockhart anything. That was the problem, not because he was a bad man. That was the other problem. If he had been a bad man, it would have been simple. She would have marched out of that store and felt righteously self-sufficient, and that would have been the end of it. But he was not a bad man. He was something considerably more dangerous. He was a good man who kept his distance, who helped without hovering, who looked at her sometimes with those dark, careful eyes in a way that made the back of her neck feel warm and her common sense feel thin. She had been a widow for 14 months. She had made herself a set of rules. The rules were practical, and they were necessary, and they had kept her from making terrible decisions in the fog of grief and financial terror that had followed Thomas Maddox's death. The rules were: do not borrow money you cannot repay, do not accept help from men who might interpret it as invitation, and do not let yourself feel things for anyone until you had made your land solvent and your life stable. Samuel Lockhart was systematically, apparently without effort, violating all 3 of those rules simultaneously. She walked down the boardwalk toward the livery where she had left her horse, and she told herself she was going to ride the 7 miles north to the Lockhart Ranch and give the man back his 32 cents or the equivalent, and tell him in the plainest, clearest language she could manage that she appreciated the gesture, but she could not accept charity from neighbors, not even well-intentioned ones, not without it meaning something she was not prepared for it to mean. She told herself this very firmly. She was so caught up in telling herself this that she almost walked directly into the subject of her thoughts at the corner of the hardware store. Samuel Lockhart was not 7 miles north. He was right here, in Hadley Creek, and he was coming out of the hardware store with a paper-wrapped parcel under one arm and a look on his face that suggested he had not expected to find Mary Maddox standing on the boardwalk looking furious. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. He was 31 years old. She knew this because she had asked around, carefully, in the subtle way that small-town women gathered information about their neighbors without appearing to do so. She was 27. He was not precisely handsome in the easy, self-aware way that some men were handsome, but he had a face that the more you looked at it, the more it settled into something that held your attention: strong jaw, dark eyes set deep under a straight brow, a quality of stillness that made him seem like a man who did not waste movement or words. He had a small scar along the left side of his jaw that she had wondered about more than once. "Miss Maddox," he said, with the careful neutrality he generally applied to their conversations. "Mr. Lockhart," she said, with somewhat more edge than she had intended. He waited. He was very good at waiting. She had noticed this about him before, that he did not fill silence the way most people did, with chatter or apology or the nervous shuffling of words to avoid the weight of a moment. "You paid for my fabric," she said. "I did," he said. "I did not ask you to." "No," he agreed. "I cannot accept that." Something moved across his face, brief and difficult to name. It was not quite hurt. It was something quieter than hurt. "You need the fabric," he said. "That is not the point," she said. "What is the point?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in it, not challenge, not defensiveness. He really wanted to know. She opened her mouth and then closed it. The honest answer was complicated, in a way she was not prepared to be honest about on the main street of Hadley Creek at noon. The honest answer was that accepting help from him felt like opening a door that she was not sure she could close again, and she was very afraid of open doors right now. The honest answer was that when she thought about him, which she did more than she was comfortable admitting, she felt something she did not have the right to feel yet, something that sat between longing and fear, and the kind of wanting that made a person make bad, irreversible decisions. "The point," she said, "is that I am capable of providing for myself." "I know that," he said immediately, as though this was not in question. "I have never thought otherwise." She stared at him. The expected defensiveness, the expected mansplaining of her own situation to her, the expected condescension that she had learned to brace for whenever she had to deal with men in matters of money and property, none of it came. He just looked at her with those dark, calm eyes and waited. "Then why?" she asked. He shifted the parcel under his arm. He looked out at the street for a moment, then back at her. "You have been working yourself down to the bone for over a year," he said. "I have seen it. Everyone with eyes has seen it. You are mending and washing for half the county while managing 40 acres alone, and you have not complained once or asked a single person for anything. You needed 32 cents and you could not get it, and I had 32 cents and I did not need it, and it seemed simple." "It is not simple," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "No," he admitted. "I suppose it is not." They stood there on the boardwalk in the November sun, and the town moved around them, and something sat between them that was not quite a conversation and not quite silence, but something in between, charged and delicate, like the air before a storm. "Come to the store and take the fabric," he said finally. "Not as charity, as a thing between neighbors who respect each other. And if it troubles you so much, then in the spring, when my hands are driving cattle to the Pearson crossing, you could perhaps have a meal ready on the north road that side of your land, and we will call it even." She looked at him for a long moment. It was the most he had said to her in 4 months of intermittent, brief, careful encounters. "That is not what charity means," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Fine, the meal in the spring." And that was the beginning of everything. She took the fabric. She went home and cut and hemmed and stitched the curtains for her 2 windows. And when she hung them in the fading afternoon light of a November Tuesday, and the blue calico with the small white flowers caught the last of the sun and filled the room with something soft and warm and almost like peace, she sat down in her chair and put her hands over her eyes and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of the past 14 months. The loneliness of it, the relentlessness of it. The way grief had burned out the soft parts of her and left something tougher and more careful in their place. She thought about Thomas. She did not think about him the way she used to. The sharp, breath-stealing grief of the first months had leveled into something lower and more constant, like a bruise that did not go away, but no longer took you by surprise. Thomas Maddox had been a good man and a bad farmer, and she had loved him with the particular tenderness of 2 young people who had married more on hope than on solid ground. He had died of a fever in September of 1881, and she had buried him on the hill above the creek, and she had stood at his grave and made herself a promise that she was going to make this land work, because she had nothing else and nowhere to go, and giving up was a form of dying, and she was not ready to die. And she had worked. God, she had worked. She had taken in mending and washing, and she had grown a kitchen garden, and she had sold eggs, and she had repaired fences, and she had herded her 6 cattle through 2 harsh winters, and she had paid down 1/3 of the mortgage, and she had not asked for a single thing from anyone. Until today, apparently, a rancher named Samuel Lockhart had answered the question she had not asked. She lowered her hands and looked at the curtains. They were beautiful. She let herself have that. Over the following weeks, the shape of things between her and Samuel Lockhart shifted in a way that was hard to precisely identify but impossible to ignore. He did not come to call, which would have been too deliberate, too loaded with implication. He did not send gifts or messages. But when their paths crossed in town, which happened with a frequency that she began to suspect was not entirely coincidental, their conversations grew longer, and the careful distance between them began to compress, inch by inch, in the way that distance always compresses when 2 people are paying close attention to each other. She learned things about him in fragments, the way you learn things about guarded people, not through direct disclosure, but through the small details that slipped out in the margins of conversations. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, that he had come to Kansas at 23 after the death of his father, that he had built the Lockhart Ranch from 60 acres and a falling-down barn over 8 years, and now ran close to 300 head of cattle and employed 6 men. She learned that he could read, which in 1882 was not universal in ranch hands and ranch owners alike, and that he had strong opinions about the reading choices available at the Hadley Creek General Store, which amounted to 3 novels, a water-damaged almanac from 1879, and the Bible. She learned that he had a younger sister named Ruth in St. Joseph, who wrote him long letters that he answered with short ones, not from lack of affection, but from what Mary was beginning to recognize as a lifelong economy with words. She learned that he had a temper, not a violent one, but a slow, deep, cold one that had something immovable at its center. From the morning, she watched him handle a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Cal Draper, who had let his cattle damage Lockhart's north fence for the 3rd time. He had been very quiet and very still, and his voice had not risen, but there had been something in his face that made it very clear to everyone observing that this was a man you would not want to push to a certain point. She also learned from Eli Holt's wife Martha, who was the repository of all Hadley Creek history, the thing about his dark past that the county whispered about. It had happened in 1879, 3 years before he arrived in Hadley Creek. He had been working a cattle drive in Colorado when there had been trouble with a local outfit that had been running stolen cattle through the same route. There had been a confrontation. A man had been shot. Not by Samuel. Martha was careful to say the shot had come from one of the other men in the stolen cattle outfit. But Samuel had been involved in the confrontation, and the dead man's brother had made noise in 2 counties about vengeance, and Samuel had spent 6 months in a kind of legal limbo while the whole thing was investigated and ultimately cleared. But mud stuck, Martha said, her voice dropping, and there were people in and around Hadley Creek who still looked at Samuel Lockhart and saw a man who had been proximate to violent death. Mary had sat with this information for several days, turning it over. She had come to the conclusion that a man being present near violence was not the same as a man being violent, and that the whispers of a town were not evidence of character, and that she had spent enough time watching Samuel Lockhart in close and distant proximity to have formed her own opinion of him. And her opinion was that he was one of the more genuinely decent human beings she had encountered, which did not mean he was simple or uncomplicated, only that his fundamental nature ran toward right. This conclusion was not, she admitted to herself on a cold December night while she sat next to her stove and listened to the wind come off the Kansas plain, entirely free of the desire to defend him that had been growing in her chest since the morning he had turned to her on the boardwalk and said, "You have been working yourself down to the bone for over a year," as though it was a fact that had troubled him personally. She was falling in love with Samuel Lockhart. She sat with that thought for a while. She was not happy about it exactly. She was not ready for it. She had all her rules, which she had made for good reasons, and love was not on the list of things she was allowed to feel until her life was more stable and more whole. And beyond her personal rules, there was the matter of Samuel himself, who was careful and guarded in ways that suggested his own complications, his own reasons for keeping distance, and who had never once done anything that could be interpreted as romantic interest, which meant she might be building something elaborate in her head from the raw materials of a few long conversations and a bolt of calico fabric. She resolved to be more sensible about the whole thing. This resolution lasted exactly until the Saturday before Christmas, when she went to town for supplies and found herself stranded by a sudden, vicious ice storm that turned the main street of Hadley Creek into a sheet of frozen danger, and made the road back to her cabin genuinely impassable until it melted. She was standing in the doorway of Holt's General Store, watching the ice come down, and calculating her options when she heard Samuel Lockhart's voice behind her. "You cannot drive home in this," he said. "I am aware," she said. "The boarding house is full," he said. "I asked." She turned. He was standing there with his coat dusted with ice crystals and his hat dark with it, and he looked like a man who had already thought through the problem and was bracing for the part where she objected to his solution. "I have a room at the hotel," she said. "There is no room at the hotel," he said. "Patterson's wife has her whole family in from Abilene." She stared at him. "My ranch hand Pete and his wife keep a spare room," he said. "They are good people, 3 miles east of town off the main road. It would be entirely proper." She did not say anything for a moment. Outside, the ice came down in white lines against the gray sky, and somewhere down the street a horse protested loudly. "And how would I get to Pete's house in this?" she asked. "I would take you," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with that steady, patient quality he had, the quality that did not rush or pressure or crowd, that simply waited for her to arrive at her own conclusion. "All right," she said. The ride to Pete and his wife Clara's house was cold and slow, both of them on horseback picking their way along the frozen road while the ice continued its assault from the gray sky above. Samuel rode slightly ahead, checking the path, and Mary followed with her coat pulled tight around her and her eyes on the road. They did not talk much. The cold did not invite conversation, but at one point her horse slipped on a frozen patch, and she grabbed the saddle horn hard and made a sound that she would later describe as a dignified intake of breath, and Samuel was immediately beside her, his hand on her horse's bridle, his face turned toward her with something in it that was not quite the controlled, neutral expression he generally wore in public. It was something more unguarded, more immediate. Something that looked very much like alarm on her behalf. "I am fine," she said quickly. He held his position beside her for another moment, looking at her with that unguarded expression, before he settled his features back into their usual composure and said, "Keep to the edge of the road. The ice is thinner over the grass." Pete and Clara were warm and hospitable and utterly unfazed by the arrival of their employer, and a woman neither of them seemed surprised to see in his company, which told Mary something that she filed away for later consideration. Clara was a small, energetic woman of about 30 who made coffee and corn bread without any suggestion that this was an imposition, and who, when Samuel said he should head back to the ranch to check on his horses, put her hands on her hips and told him that he would do no such thing in this ice, and the spare room had 2 beds and he was to stay. Samuel had looked from Clara to Mary with an expression that Mary had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was calculating whether an objection was worth the effort. He had stayed. They sat at Pete and Clara's small table that evening and ate rabbit stew and corn bread and drank coffee, and Clara talked enough for all 4 of them, asking Mary questions about her mending business and her land with the bright curiosity of someone who was genuinely interested rather than nosy, and Pete said little but smiled often. And Samuel sat across the table from Mary and ate his stew, and occasionally said something dry and quiet that made Clara laugh and made Pete nod, and made Mary realize, with a kind of helpless clarity, that she was watching him in his natural environment in a way she had never seen before. Not the careful, guarded man of public encounters, but something more relaxed, more real, a man who was clearly trusted by people who knew him well, who wore his quiet nature not as armor but simply as self. After supper, Pete fell asleep in his chair by the stove almost immediately, as men who worked hard outdoors tended to do, and Clara began to clean up, and Samuel moved to help her, which made Clara wave him off and tell him he was a guest and to sit down. He sat back down across from Mary. The oil lamp between them made a warm, unsteady light. "Thank you," she said, "for thinking of this." "You would have been stranded," he said. "I know," she paused. "You think about problems before they happen," she said. "I have noticed that." He was quiet for a moment. "Old habit," he said. "From Missouri," a slight shift in his expression. "Partly," he said. She had heard about Colorado from Martha Holt, but she did not say so. Instead, she said, "Did something teach you that? Being prepared before things go wrong?" He looked at her for a moment. Not with the closed, defended look she might have expected, but with a consideration that suggested he was deciding how much to say, not whether to say anything. "My father was not a good man to be unprepared around," he said finally. She held very still. "I am sorry," she said in the quiet, direct way that was the only way such things deserved to be said. "It was a long time ago," he said, which was not the same as it being all right, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended it was. He picked up his coffee cup and held it and looked at the lamp for a moment. "What about you?" he asked. "Were you always this self-sufficient?" "No," she said honestly. "I learned it the hard way." "Your husband, he died," she said, "and I had nothing and no one. So I became someone who could manage nothing and no one." He nodded. He did not offer pity or platitudes. He just nodded as though this was a kind of history he respected and understood. "It changes you," he said. "Yes," she said. "It does." They sat in the lamplight while the ice storm raged outside, and Pete snored softly in his chair and Clara hummed to herself at the basin, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only happens between people who have stopped performing for each other, and Mary felt it like a warmth spreading upward from the center of her chest, dangerous and real. The ice melted by the following afternoon, and she drove home in the flat, pale light of a Kansas December with the blue calico curtains waiting for her at her cabin windows, and she spent the whole 7 miles home talking herself back inside her rules and her caution and her careful self-possession. It did not work as well as it used to. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a hard one. 3 weeks after the ice storm, a blizzard swept down from the north that kept Mary housebound for 4 days, and when she dug herself out and went to check on her cattle, She found 2 of them dead from cold in the south pasture. She stood in the snow looking at them and did a rapid calculation of what this meant for her finances and felt something go tight in her stomach. That was the particular dread of a person who was already operating at the thinnest possible margins. She could not afford to lose cattle. She made it through the winter through sheer stubbornness and careful rationing, and by taking on extra washing from the boarding house women, whenever the roads were passable enough for a trip to town. She fixed a broken stall door herself and patched a hole in her barn roof in February cold that made her hands ache for a week afterward. She wrote careful letters to her sister in Ohio, who was unable to help but sent back reassurances and a recipe for bread that was more economical on flour. She thought about Samuel Lockhart. She thought about him more than she had planned and in ways that her rules explicitly did not allow. She thought about the quality of his attention, which was the particular attention of someone who was genuinely present, not half distracted, not waiting for you to stop talking, but actually there. She thought about the way he moved, with that economical quiet that had nothing to do with diffidence and everything to do with a man who had learned long ago that energy was finite and worth preserving. She thought about what he had said about his father, so spare and contained, and she thought about the shape of a wound that a person carried for long enough that it became simply part of their architecture. In February, she saw him at the store. He was picking up a catalog order and she was buying flour, and their conversation lasted 20 minutes and covered the topics of cattle mortality rates in the blizzard, the prospects for spring planting, and whether the new road grader the county had purchased would make any material difference to the North Road. It was not a romantic conversation. It was the conversation of 2 practical people in a hard season talking about practical things. But when they parted at the door of the store and he said, "Stay warm, Miss Maddox," and she said, "And you, Mr. Lockhart," she walked to her horse feeling something in her chest that was warm and unruly and refused to be practical. March came with the cold still in the ground but the sky beginning to change. That particular blue of a Kansas March sky that was more ambitious than the sky had any right to be after a winter like that one. Mary began to plan her spring garden with the focus of someone for whom the garden was not a hobby, but a material contribution to survival. She ordered seed from the catalog and turned her kitchen plot and repaired the fence around it before the birds got there first. She also began, quietly, to think about the promise she had made. A meal on the North Road in the spring when his hands drove cattle through. A meal to repay a bolt of fabric and 32 cents. She had offered it as a transaction, to make the help feel less like charity and more like an exchange, which was the only language she had felt she could accept it in at the time. But now, 3 months later, the prospect of preparing a meal for Samuel Lockhart and a cattle drive felt considerably more loaded than a transaction, and she did not know what to do with the fact that she had been thinking about it since December. She decided to do it straightforwardly and without sentiment, the way she did everything. She would make a proper meal, something that would feed a group of working men adequately, and she would deliver it at the North Road when the drive came through, and she would settle the debt she felt toward him, and that would be that. She planned the menu with the same attention she gave to everything: biscuits, beans with salt pork, dried apple pie if she could manage it, strong coffee. Enough for 8 men on a working drive. She made a note of the supplies she would need, and she set the money aside, and she told herself this was a simple, neighborly thing. She told herself this right up until the Saturday morning in late April when she was loading the wagon with her prepared food, and she realized her hands were trembling slightly, and it was not from the weight of the pot. The drive came through on a Tuesday, the last week of April 1883. She heard them before she saw them, the low, continuous sound of cattle moving, the calls of the men, the specific dusty thunder of hooves on the flat Kansas earth. She had set up at the edge of the North Road on her property line, a folding table she had borrowed from Clara, the food laid out, and the coffee in the large pot she kept for church socials. He rode in from the front of the drive, ahead of the herd, which meant he had come specifically, had ridden up from wherever he had been in the line. He pulled his horse up at the edge of her setup and looked at the table and then at her, and his expression did something she had not seen from him before, something that was unguarded and direct, a kind of warmth that he usually kept better contained. "You did not have to do all this," he said. "We had an agreement," she said. "We did," he said, and got off his horse. The ranch hands came in ones and twos, and filled their plates with a grateful efficiency that men who had been working since dawn always brought to food. And they sat on the grass and ate, and Mary refilled the coffee, and listened to Pete tell a story about a bull who had taken a dislike to the fence posts on the south pasture, and was conducting what appeared to be a systematic campaign of destruction against them. The men laughed. The sun was warm, and the sky was that impossible Kansas blue, and the smell of the plains in late April was a clean, wide thing. Samuel sat beside her on the edge of the wagon and ate his beans and biscuits without apparent ceremony, and they talked about the drive and the cattle and the weather prospects and the road grader, which had in fact made no material difference to the North Road, and it was easy and comfortable, and underneath all of it, underneath all the practical, ordinary conversation, something was pulling between them like a current in a river that neither of them was quite acknowledging. When the men had eaten and began to pull themselves together to continue the drive, Samuel stayed behind. He took his hat off and held it in both hands and looked at her table. "Mary," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. She went very still. "I have been trying to find the right way to say something for some months," he said, still looking at the table, then looking at her with that direct, careful gaze. "And I do not think there is a right way, so I am going to say it plain." "All right," she said, which was barely a word at all. "I would very much like to spend more time with you," he said. "Not as neighbors. As I would like to court you, if that is something you are open to." The Kansas wind moved across the grass between them. She thought about her rules. She thought about Thomas in the ground on the hill above the creek. She thought about 14 months of building herself back up from nothing. She thought about the calico curtains in her windows, blue with small white flowers, catching the morning light. She thought about a man walking beside her in the dark on an October road carrying her crate on his shoulder. "I am not an easy person to be with," she said. "I am independent to a fault, and I do not take direction well, and I have considerable debt, and I work harder than most men I know, which not everyone finds comfortable." "I know all of that," he said. He did not say it as a concession or a warning accepted reluctantly. He said it as a simple fact, the way you might say the sky is blue, and something in the way he said it cracked open the last careful wall she had been keeping. "Then yes," she said, "I am open to it." He put his hat back on, and the small thing happened at the corner of his mouth again, the one that was barely a smile, but somehow managed to contain more warmth than most men's full ones. And he got on his horse and rode back to his drive, and she watched him go, and then sat down on the edge of her wagon and put her hands over her eyes and breathed very deliberately for several seconds. It began. Not with fanfare or dramatic declaration, but with the particular, careful joy of two guarded people who were choosing, deliberately and consciously, to trust. He came to call on Sunday afternoons, properly, hat in hand. They walked the fence line of her property, and he told her, without her having to ask, that the south fence needed new posts, and that he thought the soil on the western slope might support winter wheat if she was interested. She told him, without him having to ask, that she had been thinking about selling 2 of her remaining cattle to pay down the mortgage and reinvesting in a small flock of sheep for wool, which she could sell to the mill at Clearwater for a better price than cattle at current market rates. He had looked at her sideways during this explanation with an expression that she had come to learn meant he was recalculating something. "That is a good plan," he said. "You sound surprised," she said. "I am not surprised," he said. "I am impressed." She felt something that she did not entirely know what to do with, and she changed the subject to winter wheat. He took her to the church social in May. which was the official public declaration that Hadley Creek had been waiting for. Judging by the way, Martha Holt watched them arrive together with the satisfied expression of a woman who had known this was coming well before either of them did. The town received this development with the mixture of genuine warmth and speculative gossip that small towns applied to romance, and Mary endured the questions and the pointed looks with the equanimity she had developed over 14 months of being the independent widow that everyone had an opinion about. She was not blind to the fact that some of those opinions about Samuel were still shaped by the Colorado story. She heard a woman named Iris Dalton say something at the quilting circle in June that she was not meant to hear, something about a man with blood on his past, and she had turned from the window with a calm she did not entirely feel and said, very quietly, that she would appreciate it if people would allow their neighbors the dignity of being judged on what they had actually done rather than the rumors about what someone had said someone else had seen. And then she had gone back to her quilting. And the room had been very quiet for a moment. And then Clara, who was at the same circle, had said, quite right in a decisive tone, and that had been largely that. Samuel, when she told him about it later, had been very quiet. You did not have to do that, he said. I know, she said. I wanted to. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his eyes that was too large and too raw to fit into a Sunday afternoon walk, and he looked away over the plain, and she let him have that moment without comment because she understood the particular kind of difficult feeling that came with being defended by someone she understood it. The summer of 1883 was long and warm and full of the particular texture that love gave to ordinary things. Mary sold her cattle and bought her sheep, and the wool money was better than she had projected. Her kitchen garden produced extravagantly, and she put up more preserves than she had counter space for. She paid down another substantial portion of her mortgage, enough that the bank manager, a dry, cautious man named Jeremiah Cole, told her in September that she was ahead of schedule on her payments, which was the closest to a compliment she had ever received from a bank manager, and she took it with the same quiet satisfaction she took most hard-won things. Samuel helped with her south fence posts in August, arriving one morning with Pete and 2 other hands and a wagon full of new posts, and working all day in the heat without any discussion of payment. She fed them all at noon and at supper, and when the others had gone, Samuel stayed to drink his coffee on her porch in the purple evening, and they sat in the particular comfortable quiet that had become one of her favorite things. Samuel, she said. Mary, he said, she had been thinking about this for some time. Tell me about Colorado, she said, keeping her voice even and her eyes on the plain. He was quiet for a moment. She let the quiet be. You already know the shape of it, he said. I know the shape that gossip makes, she said. I would like to know the actual thing. He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing, and she watched him assemble the words in the deliberate way he assembled things, carefully, without waste. I was 26, he said, on a drive to Pueblo. There was an outfit running stolen cattle on our route, had been doing it for a season, and there were men in our crew who were tired of tolerating it. I was one of them. He paused. We confronted them. What I did not know was that 2 of the men in our group were planning more than a confrontation. One of them had a personal history with the leader of the stolen cattle outfit that had nothing to do with cattle. He looked at his hands. It went bad. The man from the other side who was shot, he was not involved in the theft. He was a nephew who had come to find his uncle. He was 17. Mary said nothing. I did not fire the shot, Samuel said. But I was there, and I had called the confrontation, and a 17-year-old boy was dead because of a chain of events I had started. The investigation cleared me legally. It did not clear me in any other way. She turned to look at him. His profile was still in the evening light, the jaw with its small scar, the straight line of his brow. You have been carrying that for 7 years, she said. Yes, he said simply. And the 2 men who actually set it in motion, who were actually planning more than confrontation. One left the territory. One is in prison for an unrelated matter now. She thought about this. She thought about the weight of proximate guilt, the kind that was not legal culpability but was a different and more persistent thing. She thought about a 26-year-old man starting a chain of events he could not see the end of, and the 17-year-old at the end of it, and the way something like that would reshape a person's relationship to their own judgment, their own capacity for causing harm unintentionally. "You became careful," she said. He looked at her. "After," she said. "You became very careful about the consequences of your actions. You think 10 steps ahead. You prepared for the ice storm before it hit. You walked me home in the dark. You paid for the fabric." She paused. "You became careful because you learned what carelessness cost." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "That is not a bad man," she said. "That is a man who was changed by a terrible accident and chose to change in a direction that was decent." He looked at her for a long time without speaking, and she held his gaze without flinching, and the evening settled around them with its sounds and its light and its wide, indifferent plains, and somewhere in that stillness something between them arrived at a place it had been traveling toward for most of a year. "Mary," he said, and his voice was different, lower and less controlled. "Samuel," she said. He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, carefully, the way he did everything. But his hand was not careful once he had hers. It closed around her fingers with a warmth and a firmness that was the most deliberate thing he had ever done in her presence, and she looked down at their joined hands and felt something in her chest open up like a window in spring. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Neither of them needed to. The first time he kissed her was on an October afternoon, a full year after he had walked her home in the dark with her crate of mending supplies, on the porch of her cabin in the warm, golden light of a Kansas October. He had come to call with his usual Sunday regularity, and they had walked the western slope where she was planting her winter wheat and discussed the seeding rate, and she had told him about a letter from her sister in Ohio, and he had told her about a letter from Ruth in St. Joseph. And then they had come back to the porch for coffee, and somehow the conversation had turned quiet and comfortable and close, and he had looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said, very quietly, "May I?" And she had said yes before the question was entirely finished. It was a gentle kiss, careful in that way of his. And then it was a second kiss that was less careful, that had something in it that tasted like the long, slow burning down of restraint. And she put her hand against the side of his face and felt him still for a moment under her palm, a long-held breath finally released. When she pulled back, he had his eyes closed for a moment, and then he opened them and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen from him, something completely unguarded and luminous and stunned, like a man who had stopped expecting something for so long that when it arrived he had temporarily lost the words for it. She felt exactly the same. He proposed to her in November. He did it without elaborate stage setting, which was exactly right. He did it on the east side of her property, where her winter wheat had just broken the surface of the ground in thin, hopeful green lines, in the pale morning light of a Kansas November. And he had his hat in his hands again the way he always did when he was about to say something that mattered. And he said her name, and she turned from the wheat and looked at him, and he said, very plainly, that he loved her. That he had loved her since some time around the October night. He had walked her home, and probably before that if he was honest. And that he was asking her to marry him, not because he thought she needed anything from him or could not manage without him, because she clearly could, but because the thought of spending the rest of his life as anything other than her husband was a thought he could not make peace with. She stood in the morning light with the thin green lines of her winter wheat behind her, and the pale sky above, and this man in front of her, holding his hat, telling her the truth. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and steady and full of everything. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and put his arms around her properly, fully, without any of the careful management of proximity he had been practicing for a year. And she put her arms around his neck and felt the warmth and the solidity of him and the particular rightness of it, that she had been trying not to think about for months, and now did not have to try anymore. They were married in December of 1883, 1 year and 2 months after the calico fabric, in the Hadley Creek church on a Saturday morning with Pete and Clara and Martha Holt and Ruth, who had come on the train from St. Joseph and a dozen other people crowded into the small wooden building while the winter light came through the windows and the preacher was brief and warm and to the point. Ruth cried. Clara cried. Martha Holt did not cry but produced a handkerchief with suspicious readiness. Pete shook Samuel's hand for a long time. Mary wore her best dress, the dark green wool one, and a length of ribbon in her hair, and she stood beside Samuel Lockhart and said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and meant every word of every one of them. He slid the ring on her finger and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the expression on his face was the same one he had worn on the porch in October, that luminous, unguarded, stunned quality, except now it was settled into something more permanent, more certain, a man who had found the ground under his feet. After the ceremony, there was a supper at Clara and Pete's house, more people than Clara's table could technically hold. But Clara was a woman who considered this a challenge rather than a limitation, and she had borrowed 3 tables from the church hall and covered them with food, and had done it all with the pleased, maternal efficiency of someone who had been invested in this outcome for a considerable time. They moved into the Lockhart ranch house together, which was larger than her cabin and considerably better built, though it had the particular quality of a house that had been occupied only by men functional, clean enough, but empty of the small things that made a place a home. Mary looked at it with the appraising eye of a woman who had made a home from 40 acres of scrubland and a cabin with 2 windows, and she saw the possibilities in it. She made curtains. She made them from a blue calico she chose herself, at Holt's General Store, paying for it herself, standing at the counter with her coin purse and counting out the money with steady hands. And Eli Holt did not say anything about another account being paid, because there was no debt to pay this time, only a woman buying the fabric she wanted and taking it home to make something beautiful. She hung them in the front room of the Lockhart ranch house, and when Samuel came in from the south pasture at the end of the day and saw them catching the late afternoon light, he stopped in the doorway and looked at them and then at her. "You made the whole house different," he said. "Yes," she said. "That was the intention." He came across the room and kissed her in the unceremonious, warm way he had when they were at home, and there was no performance required of either of them. One hand at her jaw and his forehead against hers after, and she put her hands flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a mild one, a blessing after the brutality of the previous year, and the Lockhart ranch prospered. Mary's sheep paid off handsomely. She had been right about the wool price, and she transferred the management of the small flock to the ranch's operations, keeping her own records and making her own decisions about the breeding program, which Samuel supported without interference and with what she recognized as genuine interest. The winter wheat on her 40 acres, now folded into the ranch's land, came up in March green and promising. She wrote to her sister in Ohio. She wrote to Ruth in St. Joseph. She received a long, warm letter from Ruth in return that said, among other things, that she had never seen her brother write letters that were actually long before, and that she had read his last 2 letters 3 times each because they were so unexpectedly full of description and feeling, and that whatever Mary was doing, please keep doing it. Mary laughed at this and read it to Samuel over the breakfast table, and he said with complete calm that he had no idea what Ruth was talking about, and Mary looked at him and he looked at her, and the corner of his mouth did the thing, and she laughed again. In May of 1884 she told him she was expecting. She told him on the porch in the evening, in the same chairs they had been sitting in when he had taken her hand for the first time, because this felt like the right place for important things, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that was unusual for a man as controlled as he generally was. Something came first that was shock, then something that shifted to a kind of overwhelmed joy, then something that went very still and careful in a way she recognized. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question was asking several things at once. "Yes," she said, and she meant all the answers. He reached over and took her hand in both of his and held it, looking out at the plain, and she could see him recalculating things the way he always did, thinking 10 steps ahead, preparing for a world that was about to change completely. But underneath all of that, visible in the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his stillness, was something that she did not think he was accustomed to feeling, pure happiness. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said. He turned and looked at her, and his expression was the most fully open she had ever seen it. "I am going to try to be," he said. "That is enough," she said. "That is everything." Their son was born in January of 1885, during a snowstorm that Clara navigated with the competence of a woman who had helped with enough ranch deliveries to be unintimidated by weather. Samuel was in the next room, and she could hear him moving, the sound of his boots on the floor, back and forth, the particular restless movement of a controlled man at the absolute limit of his capacity to be controlled. She heard Pete at one point tell him quietly to sit down, and heard Samuel say something short in return, and then the boots kept moving. When Clara put the baby in her arms and the baby was alive and whole, and making the specific angry noise of a very new person encountering air for the first time, Mary looked at him and felt something so large and wordless that the only honest response to it was tears, which she allowed herself for about 30 seconds before she pulled herself together and called Samuel's name. He came through the door and crossed the room, and she held the baby up and watched Samuel Lockhart, who had been careful and controlled and economical with everything including his own heart for 33 years, look at his son for the first time. His face did something she had no words for. Not the stunned, luminous quality of the wedding morning, not even the overwhelmed joy of May. Something deeper and more foundational, like a man who has built something from nothing, and then seen it become real in a way that exceeds what he had the imagination to plan for. "Samuel," she said softly. He sat down on the edge of the bed and reached out one large, careful hand and touched the baby's face with one finger, so gently it was barely contact, and then he looked at Mary. "Hello," he said, which was not specifically addressed to either of them but to everything. They named the boy James Thomas Lockhart James for Samuel's father's father, the one good thing from that line, and Thomas for the man who had been Mary's husband and whose grave still stood on the hill above the creek, and who deserved, she thought, to be remembered in something living. James Thomas grew up on the Lockhart Ranch with the particular confidence of a child who was well loved, which is its own kind of inheritance. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and a temperament that was the interesting combination of both thoughtful but not cautious, determined but not reckless. He followed his father around the ranch from the time he could walk and sat in his mother's lap while she worked on the ranch accounts and fell asleep in the evenings to the sound of his parents' voices. Ruth came to visit in the summer of 1885 and declared herself fully in love with the baby, her brother, her sister-in-law, the ranch, the plains, and Kansas generally, and she stayed for 2 months, which Samuel said was because she had no sense of proportion and Mary said was because the baby had that effect on people. Ruth laughed and agreed with both of them. In 1886, the mortgage on Mary's original 40 acres was paid off in full. She went to the bank on a June morning and sat across from Jeremiah Cole and handed over the final payment and received the deed free and clear, and she held it in both hands for a moment and thought about everything that had led to this piece of paper. The 9 months of a dead husband, the 14 months alone, the 32 cents, the bolt of calico, the man on the road in October, the long, slow construction of a life that was genuinely hers. "Congratulations, Mrs. Lockhart," Jeremiah Cole said in his dry, cautious way. "Thank you," she said. She rode home with the deed in her coat pocket and went directly to find Samuel, who was in the south pasture talking to Pete about the new fencing. She held up the deed without saying anything. He looked at it. He looked at her. And then he crossed the pasture and put his arms around her and held her, properly, fully, in front of Pete and two other ranch hands who had the collective good sense to suddenly find other things to look at. She pressed her face against his shoulder and smelled the particular smell of him, horse and sun, and the cotton of his work shirt, and felt the solidity of his arms and thought, for the first time in 4 years without any qualification or asterisk or caveat, that she was happy. Not relieved, not surviving, not managing, happy. In the spring of 1887, Mary told Samuel she was expecting again. This time on the same porch in the same chairs, and he did not go through the sequence of expressions. He simply turned to her with that already settled warmth that had become the permanent quality of his face around her, and said, "That is wonderful news," and took her hand. "You are not shocked this time," she said. "I am delighted this time," he said. The shocked version was embarrassing. "It was not embarrassing," she said. "It was one of the best things I have ever seen." He looked at her sideways with the expression that meant he was deciding whether to be self-deprecating or accept the compliment, and he accepted the compliment, which was growth. Their daughter arrived in November of 1887, in much less dramatic circumstances than James Thomas's entrance. A calm, efficient birth attended by Clara and the town doctor, a man named Hewitt who had arrived in Hadley Creek the previous year, and who brought with him a level of medical knowledge that Clara said was a genuine improvement on the previous arrangement of hoping for the best. They named her Alina Ruth Alina for no specific person, simply because it was beautiful, and Ruth for Samuel's sister, who received this news by letter insent. Joseph and replied within the week with a letter so long it required 2 postage stamps, and contained the information that she was so overwhelmed that she had sat down on her kitchen floor and cried, and was coming to visit at Christmas, and nothing could stop her. Nothing stopped her. James Thomas was 2 years old and thoroughly opinionated about the baby sister, alternating between intense curiosity and profound suspicion of the additional person who had appeared in his house, and immediately commanded all available attention. Mary watched her son process this new reality with the particular amusement of a mother who recognized his father's tendency to recalculate when the world changed shape. Samuel was different with Alina than he had been in those early, careful days with James Thomas, not more loving, but more settled in it, more fluent in the language of being someone's father, which he had been learning for 2 years. He held Alina with an ease that he had not had with James Thomas, and the baby responded to him with the absolute trust of a creature who had never in her brief existence been given any reason to feel otherwise. Mary watched him hold her daughter in the lamplight of the kitchen one evening, while James Thomas slept, and Alina made the small, satisfied sounds of a recently fed infant. And she thought about an October evening in 1882 when she had stood at the side of a road with a broken wagon wheel, and a man she did not know had stopped to help her, and about all the 10,000 unrepeatable small steps that had led from there to here, to this kitchen, to this man, to these children, to this life that was full and real and earned. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, because he had been watching her watch him for several minutes. "I am thinking about the wheel spoke," she said. He thought about this for a moment. "Pete fixed that in under an hour," he said. "Yes," she said, "efficient beginning. The corner of his mouth did the thing." She crossed the kitchen and sat beside him, and he shifted Alina so that his arm was around her as well, and the 4 of them, James Thomas asleep in his room and Alina drowsy in her father's arms and Samuel and Mary closed together in the lamplight, were present in one of those ordinary, unremarkable, entirely irreplaceable moments that make up the actual substance of a life. The years that followed were full ones. The ranch grew. Mary's sheep flock expanded to a scale that required its own dedicated hand. A quiet young man named Henry, who had come to Hadley Creek from somewhere east with an evident gift for animals and a willingness to learn. The winter wheat became a reliable part of the ranch's income. Mary took on the ranch's full accounts management, which suited her mathematical mind and her natural inclination toward forward planning, and the Lockhart Ranch became one of the more solidly run operations in the county, which was visible not in the display of wealth, but in the absence of financial crisis. Samuel began teaching James Thomas to ride in earnest when the boy was 4, and Mary stood at the fence and watched them move around the paddock together. Her husband's patient, particular voice and her son's intense concentration, and felt the specific variety of fullness that had no short word in English. She thought sometimes about Thomas Maddox. She thought about him with the particular tenderness of distance, and she kept his grave on the hill above the creek clean and planted with the small flowers that grew easily in Kansas summers. And she took James Thomas there and told him that before his father there had been another man who had loved his mother, and that the 40 acres of their ranch had belonged to that man and had been kept by his mother's stubbornness, and that Thomas Maddox had been a good man and deserved to be remembered. James Thomas, who was 4 when this conversation happened, had asked several clarifying questions, and she had answered them, and he had gone back down the hill and apparently decided that this was a fact of the world like other facts of the world, to be integrated and stored. She told Samuel that evening that she had taken James Thomas to the grave. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" He asked with the same question he had been asking her for years in various forms, always meaning several things at once. "Yes," she said with the same answer. "He was part of your life," Samuel said. "He was," she said, "and you are my life." Those things are both true and they are not in conflict. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his face the particular quality she had come to know as the thing he felt when she said something that landed somewhere deep in him where he was still learning to let things land. "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I know." She reached out and took his hand. In 1890, Ruth Lockhart married a man named Daniel Greer, a schoolteacher from St. Joseph with spectacles and a warm laugh, and a genuine interest in what Ruth thought about things, which Ruth had described in her letter to Mary as the most attractive quality she had ever encountered in a man. Mary agreed with feeling. They came to Kansas for the summer that year, Ruth and Daniel and Ruth's obvious joy, and the Lockhart Ranch received them with the warm ease of a house that had long since settled into its own abundance. The children loved their Aunt Ruth, who told stories extravagantly and gave opinions freely and brought books from the St. Joseph Lending Library that were months ahead of anything available in Hadley Creek. James Thomas, who was 5 by then, followed Daniel Greer around asking questions about school teaching with the earnest intensity of a child who was already forming ambitions. Leaner, not yet 3, mostly sat on Ruth's lap and patted her face with the democratic affection of toddlers everywhere. Mary and Ruth sat on the porch one evening after supper while the men walked the perimeter of the south pasture and the children slept, and Ruth said with her characteristic directness, "You saved him, you know." Mary looked at her. "Samuel," Ruth said. "He was so alone when I would visit him before you, not sad exactly, just closed, like a house with all the shutters down." She looked at the plains. "You opened everything up." "He opened himself up," Mary said. "I was simply present for it." "You are being modest," Ruth said. "I am being accurate," Mary said. "He did the work. I just made it feel safe to." Ruth looked at her with an expression that was unmistakably fond. "You two are remarkably well suited," she said. "I know," Mary said without false modesty, because it was true and she had long since given up pretending that the obvious things needed hedging. In 1891, a 3rd child arrived. Samuel had said on the porch when she told him that they were running out of names from both families. She had told him that the world had more names than their families, and he should not worry about it. The baby was a boy, and they named him William. He came into the world in April with the spring, a fact he seemed to embrace from the first moment, vigorous, responsive, loud about his preferences, and possessed of a quality of determined cheerfulness that was so immediately apparent that the midwife commented on it as she handed him over. He had his mother's amber eyes and his father's strong jaw, and a temperament that was his own, distinct and individual, as each child's temperament was. James Thomas was 6 and considered himself an expert on babies by this point, having survived the arrival of a leaner. He announced to his father within the first week that William was, provisionally, acceptable. Samuel told him that was very generous. James Thomas agreed. A leaner at 3 was immediately and fiercely in love with William. She appointed herself his protector with a seriousness that was, Mary told Samuel, entirely her father's daughter. Samuel said he did not know what she was talking about. The expression on his face while he said this was not convincing. Hadley Creek grew during the 1880s and into the 1890s, the way successful frontier towns grew, not explosively, but steadily, each year adding a building or a business or a family, the town's life deepening and accumulating. The general store expanded. A second school was built. The road grader was replaced with a better one that made a material difference to the North Road this time. Mary joined the Ladies' Aid Society in 1888 and promptly began reorganizing their accounts, which had been kept in a system she described to Samuel as optimistic. She taught herself debentry bookkeeping from a manual she ordered from a publishing house in Chicago, and brought the society's finances to a clarity they had not had in their history. The women of the society received this with varying levels of enthusiasm, but no one argued with the results. She was not a woman who became invisible in her marriage. She had never been that woman, and she was not going to start. Samuel had understood this from the beginning, had, she thought, specifically been drawn to it, and the structure of their life together was built on the genuine partnership of two people who both thought clearly, and both had strong opinions and had long since learned the particular art of disagreement that did not damage. They argued sometimes. Not often, and not about fundamental things, but about the real, substantive questions of running a ranch and raising children and navigating the world, and their arguments were the productive kind, the kind that ended in better solutions than either of them had started with. She was reading in the front room one evening in the spring of 1892, James Thomas and a leaner both in bed, William working very hard on the project of learning to walk, which he had recently decided was his primary occupation in life, when Samuel came in from outside and stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked up from her book and saw something in his face that was different from the usual. "What?" she said. He crossed the room and sat across from her and put his hands together between his knees, the posture that meant he was about to say something that required more than his usual economy of words. "I have been offered a position," he said, "on the county commission." She put her book down. "What kind of position?" "Representative for this district," he said. 3 years. It would mean time in the county seat." She looked at him. She knew what this was. It was a form of acknowledgement that the county offered to men whose reputations had solidified into something trustworthy, something worth official weight. It was also the complete and public burial of the Colorado story, because you did not put men with unresolved shadows on county commissions. "Do you want it?" she asked. He thought about this with his usual care. "I think I could be useful," he said. "The North Road, the water rights dispute on the eastern boundary, the new school funding, those things need people who are going to deal with them straight." "Then yes," she said. "It will take time from the ranch. We have Henry and Pete and 4 other good men," she said, "and I am here." He looked at her. "Samuel," she said, "you spent years making yourself smaller than you are because of what happened in Colorado. You have been useful in 100 ways in this county for a decade. This is a county saying it sees that." She paused, "and it is not wrong." The corner of his mouth did the thing. He took the position. He served 3 years on the county commission and was competent and straightforward, and occasionally infuriating to the men who wanted things done in the back room, handshaking way, because he had a particular talent for naming what was actually happening in a room and a complete unwillingness to pretend he could not see it. He came home from county seat meetings sometimes with the suppressed, rigid quality of a man who had been in a room with people whose judgment he found difficult to respect, and Mary would hand him coffee and ask specific questions, because questions were the thing that worked with him, and he would answer them in his precise, thorough way, and by the end of the coffee the problem was generally half solved already. The 3 years ended, and he did not take a second term, because the ranch needed his full attention, and the children were growing fast, and there were things at home that mattered more than the county seat. He left the commission without drama, and with the respect of nearly everyone he had worked with, and came home and went back to work, and Mary thought that this was the most quintessentially Samuel thing he had ever done. James Thomas turned 10 in 1895, and was reading at a level that impressed his teacher and farming at a level that impressed his father. And he had by this time developed the particular combination of his parents' qualities, in a form that was entirely his own, careful and observant like Samuel, direct and practical like Mary, and possessed of a quality of warmth toward other people that was large and genuine, and did not know where it came from, though both his parents privately thought it was simply a good outcome from a lucky roll. Eleanor at 7 was the child who had inherited Samuel's quality of stillness and Mary's quality of determination, a combination that meant she was extremely calm about things she had decided to do and absolutely immovable about doing them. She had also developed a gift for drawing that Clara had discovered, and was encouraging with the cheerful investment of a woman who took other people's talents personally. William at 4 was primarily interested in animals, anything with 4 legs, and had befriended every dog and horse and working animal on the ranch, with the democratic warmth of someone who had decided that species was not a meaningful category. Samuel told Henry that William was either going to be an excellent rancher or a veterinarian, and Henry said, with the thoughtful quality of a man who had watched children grow up around animals for years, that those were not mutually exclusive. The Lockhart Ranch in 1895 was not the same place it had been in 1882. The house had expanded twice, with a proper kitchen and a second sleeping room, and the barn had been rebuilt after a lightning strike in 1889, and there were fences and outbuildings and a proper corral, and the kitchen garden had grown into a substantial vegetable plot that fed the household through 3 seasons and well into the 4th with careful putting up. And there were curtains in every window, blue calico in the front room which Mary had replaced twice as the years weathered them, always choosing the same pattern, the small white flowers on blue because some things deserve to be kept, warm wool in the kitchen, lighter cotton in the children's rooms. Every window had its covering, every room had its warmth. On an October evening in 1895 October, because October was the month that kept giving them occasions, Mary stood at the front room window and looked out at the Lockhart land, the wide sweep of it in the harvest light, gold and amber under a sky that was doing the particular thing Kansas skies did at that hour, blazing down toward dark. She heard Samuel's boots on the porch steps, the sound she had been hearing for 12 years that still had the same quality for her, that pull of warmth and recognition. He came inside and stood behind her, and without a word he put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they looked out at their land together. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time you walked into this room?" "There were no curtains," he said. "There were no curtains," she agreed. He pressed his lips briefly against her hair. "You changed everything," he said. "It was not just about the curtains." "We changed everything," she corrected, because that was accurate and because accuracy was one of the things they had always owed each other. "We changed everything," he agreed. Outside, James Thomas was bringing in the last of the hay with the ranch hands, his voice carrying across the yard in the warm evening. Inside, somewhere down the hall, Eleanor was drawing something at her little desk, the scratch of her pencil audible. William had fallen asleep on the kitchen rug after supper, having declared himself finished with the day with the complete authority of a 4-year-old, and Clara, who had come to supper and stayed to talk, had tucked a blanket around him, and he lay there in the lamplight with the perfect animal confidence of a child who had never had a reason to feel unsafe. "We did all right," Mary said. Samuel's arms tightened around her just slightly. "Yes," he said, "we did." Outside, the Kansas evening came down in all its ancient, indifferent beauty, and the Lockhart ranch received it the way it received everything, the hard seasons and the good ones, the storms and the calms, the years of scarcity and the years of plenty, with the particular resilience of a place that had been built by people who understood that nothing worth having came without cost, and that the cost was not the point. The point was this: the curtains in the window, the sleeping child on the rug, the voices of working men in the evening yard, the warmth of two people who had found each other on an October road by the particular grace of a broken wheel, and had had the courage, both of them, to not look away. The calico had been blue, with small white flowers. She had counted every coin twice. She had come up short by 32 cents, and a rancher had paid, and that had been the first stitch in a life that had grown, over the years, into something as large and warm and irreplaceable as a quilt made from all the best pieces of everything you had survived and kept. Mary Maddox, Mary Lockhart, now stood in the golden evening with her husband's arms around her and her children in the rooms behind her and the land they had built together stretching out to the horizon, and she felt the full, particular, irreducible weight of it. She would not trade a single day, not the hard ones, not the lonely ones, not even the 32 cents, because all of it had led here to this evening, to this man, to this life. And this life was everything.